As the world becomes increasingly focused on global unrest from pandemic viruses, racial inequality, terrorism, climate change, financial and political instability, and more, people are dealing with both external and internal conflict, constant fear, and uncertainty. Hi, I'm Dr. Karen Wilson Starks, your host for the Voice of Leadership and for Dr. Karen Speaks Leadership. And today, my special guest, Jane Gunn from the UK, answers the following questions. What can we do as individuals and as organizations to better understand and transform this conflict? What deeper meaning and message might be behind all of these scenarios? And how do we find harmony and balance in a crazy world? Well, Jane Gunn, also known as the Barefoot Mediator, is a trained mediator and facilitator expert in conflict resolution. She is listed as a global leader in Who's Who mediation and is featured in the Legal 500 Hall of Fame. Jane is president of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators and is a former director and board member of the Civil Mediation Council of England and Wales. The author of 3 popular books, How to Beat Bedlam in the Boardroom and Boredom in the Bedroom, The Authority Guide to Conflict Resolution, and The Mole and the Mountain. She has spoken to the United Nations, the White House, and the European Commission. Jane helps people in all walks of life to become resolutionaries, teaching them the basic skills of mediation. She enables people to deal with difference and diversity in ways that are non-adversarial and solution-focused. Her mission is to create a community of resolutionaries equipped to lead and inspire others in times of change, challenge, and crisis. Jane has worked with organizations large and small, including Cable and Wireless, Capita, the NHS, BAA, Bacardi Martini, McLaren Racing, and many more. Jane's skill in providing practical tools and techniques is that she applies these practical approaches to organizations of all sizes across all sectors. She also gets people motivated, energized, and committed to what needs to happen next as they talk about what matters most to them and their organization. And the bonus is that her approach is also interactive and fun. So welcome, Jane, to the Voice of Leadership and to Dr. Karen Speaks Leadership.
Oh, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I'm so delighted to have you here, Jane, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. I think the conversation that we're about to embark on is one that's really needed in our world. And before we get deep into it, I've got to ask you about this Barefoot Mediator. So tell us, we know you're known as that, but what does that mean? How did you get that title?
Well, it started as a joke. It's actually, we've just talked about this, very hot today. So I'm actually sat here at my desk with bare feet. And this started in lockdown. I was doing all my work remotely, but with bare feet. And it started as a joke. And then I thought, well, I wonder what a barefoot mediator actually is or could be. And to me, I looked up this term and discovered the barefoot doctors who were named such in China. And the idea was, could you be a resource within your community? And so the idea is for barefoot mediators, how can we in our families, in our communities, use the skills, the tools, and the mindset that and the principles of mediation that I teach at home, in our families, in our communities, and in our organizations.
So I get the impression that it's being very accessible and being part of the community and sort of comfortable with the people that you're going to be helping in a sense.
Yes. And I think mediation in the way I practice it is commercial mediation has been used traditionally in commercial and legal disputes. And I just want to say it's for everybody. It's not just for use in the boardroom and in a legal dispute. Everybody can use these skills and the mindset, and so many problems that we need to be talking about in the world right now, as you alluded to in your introduction.
Absolutely. So let's talk about that a little bit since you're working principally as a mediator and you're saying it's beyond the boardroom. There's also issues in families, amongst friends and people individually, not just organizations. Tell us a little bit about the kinds of issues then that you do address and for whom. Maybe to give us some individual type examples as well as some corporate or organizational examples. And how are you operating to create what you call this transformative mediation?
Oh, great question. So my work does tend to be with organizations, and I do typically work with boards or with partnerships. A lot of my work at the moment is advising boards. I'm also advising on ethics. I'm the ethics officer for one of the boards I work for. But, the first book I wrote, which has got the quirky title you mentioned, How to Beat Bedlam in the Boardroom and Boredom in the Bedroom. Now, the reason I wrote that is whenever I'm working with executives, they'll say to me, oh, yes, and I've also got a problem with my teenagers at home. And how do I deal with that? And actually, that's impacting on my ability to be present at work. And the answer is it's the same principles, it's the same set of skills. So very often we can look at both of those, particularly when I'm running a workshop, and say, well, actually, you could use the same principles in your home life as you can in your boardroom.
That's absolutely true. I find that that's the case as well. And because you're developing a trusted relationship with the person, they go beyond just what's going on in the business and talk about what is happening at home, even if it's boredom in the bedroom. So,
Yeah.
what a great title. And it's true that you have opportunity to have a broader conversation.
Yes. And then you just asked me about transformative. What's the transformative approach? It doesn't mean transforming people in a psychological sense. What it means is that there's four theories of conflict which we tend to operate of. So one of the questions we ask is, what is the people or the people I'm working with, what's their experience? What's their perception of what conflict is? So conflict is sometimes seen as a struggle for power. Then it's seen as a struggle for rights, who's most right legally or morally. Then in mediation, we start to look up, but what do people need? What are their needs and interests, their fears and concerns? How can we create a deal? But at the lowest level, what we're really dealing with is that the conflict is not the problem. It's the breakdown of the interaction between the people who are trying to resolve the problem. And if in the skills that I bring them, we can transform the interaction so that that becomes more effective, more productive, less negative, then they themselves can come back to finding their own resolution. So self-determination, you resolve the parties to a conflict, the ones that decide what the resolution is going to be.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense because what you're saying is you're giving people, I would say, some communication tools. You're creating a space where they can have the conversation. And then when they have the conversation, what emerges is what I call the third solution, which is something that's really going to benefit them both. It really is a win-win, and they would not have thought of it on their own. It's through the dialogue together that
Yes.
solution actually emerges. And that's what it sounds like you're talking about.
Absolutely. And the thing that tends to break down for all of us when we're in tension or conflict is we forget to listen to each other. We're just so busy on being on transmit and here's what I think and here's why I'm right. And the ability to step in with a neutral mediator is just to give back that space to listening and help people hear each other. And that, to be honest, is the most transformative thing.
Well, we certainly need a lot more of that in our world today, Jane. There's
We
no
do.
question. So let me ask you about a contrast because I know that you have been educated as an attorney and you worked particularly in the medical field as an attorney. So how is your work different today in comparison to what you used to do before? Give us a little bit of a compare and contrast.
Whatever field you're working in law, it tends to be based on those principles that we talked about in terms of conflict. It's quite adversarial. It can be quite aggressive, the way lawyers talk to each other, even if they're dealing with a commercial contract. We are just trained to look at what's right and to see things in black and white terms. what we're trying to do with a mediation approach is definitely to look under the surface and say, well, what conversations could we be having to find out what people really need and what their interests are and what their hopes are, and what their fears are and what their concerns are. And all of those things are the things that transform the interaction, because I didn't know those things. And they're not typically things that a lawyer will look at. If you go to a lawyer with any kind of problem or potential legal case, they're looking immediately to say, well, are you right or are you wrong legally? And, that's where their focus is. So it's what we call very much on positions. But under the surface is what we talk about as the principles. What are the principles that are driving? What are the core drivers for people internally? And that's, again, you talked in the introduction about conflict being internal as well as external. It's what we carry within us as well that creates the sense of conflict that we have.
Well, I certainly can see how in the more traditional attorney approach of black and white and right and wrong, you're going to have winners and losers. And so people are not going to walk away from the table across the board being happy with the resolution. Yet the way that you're talking about this, there's an opportunity, a possibility to get to solutions that really work for both parties.
Yes, definitely. And it's up to them. And the solution is whatever they think is the right way forward. So I was asked the other day by a potential client, how do you define success in mediation? And the answer to that question is, it depends. It depends what success means to the parties. It depends at what timeline you're looking at. Are you looking at now? Are you looking at 5 years later? So it's very difficult to define what success is. Success is whatever success is for them, not what success might mean for me. So again, it's up to the people I'm working with to say, this is a good outcome for me, actually. Or actually, I want to go back to litigation. That, for me, I've looked at all the options and the best option for me is to continue fighting. If that's their choice, that's their choice. And they should have the freedom to make that choice.
Oh, yeah, I love that. It's not off the table. It's just that you are considering other possibilities first before they go to the litigation route. And I would imagine that for a lot of people, that's probably more satisfying in terms of what they end up coming up with, as
Yeah.
opposed to just going litigation first. Let me ask this to Jane. You believe that mediation is the business skill of the future. And tell us a little bit about that. How come you see it as the business skill of the future? And how does your concept of resolutionary fit in with that? What is resolutionary?
Oh, thank you for asking me that. Well, I see this as the business skill of the future because I think more than ever, and certainly I'm looking at clients I'm currently working with, there's so many issues to be dealt with, so many tensions in meetings, partnerships, boardrooms. It's just being able to take that step back and think, again, use these skills of mediation and think, well, there may be more than one narrative here. There may be more than one solution here. There may be a better way for us to hear each other out around the board table rather than sticking to our own positions. So it's bringing this framework, if you like, for how do we look at problems and how do we work through them in a way that gives us options, that enable us to have dialogue, and that enables us to be more effective, but not adversarial. So it's that. And my concept then of resolutionaries is that everybody can be one. It's the Barefoot Mediator thing. Everybody, if they understand the principles of mediation, can be or become a resolutionary as opposed to a revolutionary.
And let's contrast that. What's the difference between a resolutionary and a revolutionary?
Well, I think a revolutionary, we're all trying to change the world or change our experience of the world or change our experience of our interactions in the world. But I think if you're being a revolutionary, you're doing that in a more confrontational way. If you're being a resolutionary, you're bringing these mediation skills and mindset to bear in the way you're doing that. And that's what I'd like people to think of, wearing the badge of being a resolutionary.
All right, I love that. I love it. So we know that in business today, and particularly business executives, they have to make a lot of critical decisions every day about how they're going to survive and thrive in the business. And the business is also challenged by disagreements with colleagues. And right now, for example, in our current conflict times, we have workplaces where you have both Jews and Muslims, and they have very different perspectives on the war in Israel. So, using that maybe as an example, what are some of the things you might do to resolve some workplace conflicts because these two groups are at odds, even at work?
Yes, very interesting. I mean, going back to my time as president at the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, that was when the war with Ukraine blew up, and we had a particular event coming up where it's what we call a moot, where we had an arbitration moot where people represent in a mock mediation or mock arbitration. And there was great tension because one of the teams was going to be coming from Russia. And I was, called in to say whether this, to explore how we were going to deal with this problem. But at the end of the day, we have to go back to the idea that everybody is a human being. And we've all got our own needs and interests and our own perspective on something. And that perspective is not necessarily the same perspective as the country that we come from, the nation that we come from. We're all individuals. And we've all got our own concerns. And I think, labeling someone as only a Jew or only a Muslim or only someone from Russia is a real challenge. I met a wonderful colleague from Russia the other day, and I think, she was worried that I might judge her as coming from Russia. But actually, she's just another colleague. And, then if we start to have dialogue, you realize that underneath, which is one of the exercises we do in workshops, if you start to explore some of the tensions where people have polar opposite views, actually underneath what they actually want for humanity and what the world is not often very different. They have a different perception of it, but that's come from a whole history and lifetime of messaging and experience. I did work for a while with a charity which is US-based called Seeds of Peace, and they work very much with colleagues from Israel and Palestine, in fact, teenagers from Israel and Palestine, and they bring them together in a kind of holiday camp experience where they are involved in doing games together as well as dialogue, but they go through a 3-week process where they are breaking down those barriers of right or wrong and the history that they bring, until they begin to see each other as just fellow human beings. How can we explore, and how can we then together find answers to the problems? So that was a very powerful experience as well.
I think at the end of the day, it sounds to me what you're really talking about is facilitating the opportunity for people to truly get to know one another, first of all, and not just be operating based on the stereotypes or what they've heard. They have a personal experience. And then from that personal experience, they listen and come to common ground. Because at the end of the day, as human beings, we do have some common ground between us, no matter what country we come from and so on. I know that years and years and years ago, when we were really in the Cold War with Russia back in the day in the United States, meeting Russian people truly individually, what I observed and learned was that just the same as us in terms of people and people who you could love and care about. And what happens at the bigger government level sometimes obscures that fact. So I think it's also true about other communities, like you mentioned, Ukraine and Russia now, and then also with Israel and some of her Arab neighbors in that sense. So yeah, it's a really important point.
It's just that often we don't get that opportunity to meet those other people. Very often they're behind a screen or behind a wall or, on the other side of a war, and we don't get the chance to meet them as fellow human beings.
Yeah, and that really does help a lot when we can do that and when we can facilitate that. So your work is really, really important. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and I'm going to talk a little bit about the medical system because I know you worked a lot in the medical arena as well. And in the United States, the medical system is becoming less person and people centered. It's becoming more focused on illness than wellness and sick care more than health care. So first, I want to ask you what's happening in the UK in that respect and Europe in general. What are you seeing in terms of how the medical profession is showing up and interacting with people?
It's very similar, really, Karen, here. And I think it's a shame I interviewed a doctor on my own podcast about ethics, both medical and legal ethics, but she described the process we've gone through is that the medical system has become protocol led rather than patient led and technocratic rather than Hippocratic, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've moved away from the values and the principles of that Hippocratic oath, which is do no harm, really to a more corporate model where you're looking much more at guidelines and protocols and so on, and then these being protocol led rather than patient led. And the honest answer is it creates challenges and tension for the doctors working within the system as well as for the patients, because they are not able to treat the patients as individuals as well as the patients would like to be treated as individuals. So quite a lot of tension.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that in the United States, there has been for many years now a move towards treating body parts more than treating the person as a holistic
Yes.
individual, where the body parts have to be considered as a whole and integrating the knowledge about one system and how it affects the next system. And often there's not anyone who's got that responsibility to look at the person in a whole way. And a lot of mistakes or unintended negative outcomes can occur if you're just looking at one part and then the next part. That's what I've seen a lot here.
Always, when I've been dealing with a medical negligence situation, you will find that the patient themselves has gone through too many hoops. They've seen too many different doctors or been through too many different departments, and they haven't had one person who's followed them through and been able to understand them as a whole person. It's true of
Yeah.
so many things that we just need to see the big picture, the whole picture.
That's essentially what you've been talking about so far this whole time, is the ability to see the big picture and the whole rather than just our
Yeah.
side or our part of it.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I find that going to the doctor these days, it's fascinating that in reviewing, let's say, lab results or something like that, I'm that sort of person who likes to see, well, where am I now? How does that compare to the reference range? Are my numbers continuing to go up and they shouldn't be going up? What are the patterns? What's happening? As that informs what decisions I'm going to make. And I find, at least here, most often the doctor doesn't even tell you a number. They'll say, oh, you're fine, and with no qualification. And then as soon as that number heads into the danger zone range, oh, now we have to do something. And now you have less options because
Yeah.
it's in the danger range. You could have intervened much earlier and even avoided the danger range.
One of the real challenges, I think, for doctors, particularly in the age we're living in, is this concept of fully informed consent. And that comes as well from the mediator. The process I'm practicing in mediation is to enable parties to make their own choice because they've got all the information they need to make that choice. And that, again, is something I think is important in medicine, is that patients are enabled to make a fully informed choice and that consent is important. So a doctor has got to work with the patient so that the patient fully understands, for example, the results they're being given and what choices does that enable them to make together as a patient and doctor. And I think sometimes that gets lost somewhere in the mix, is how do we fully explain to the patient what this means, what their options are, what the consequences are. And that's exactly the same as we would be doing in a mediation. So the principles fit really well across the two.
Well, yes, I'm glad you went into informed consent because I was just thinking about that. And I know that you and I are both strong believers in personal agency and
Yes.
self-determination, and you need
Yes.
informed consent in order to make the best decisions. So, what are some of the concerns that you have in today's world about getting to that informed consent? What are some of the barriers? What often stands in the way?
I think one of the things for doctors, if we're still talking about the medical profession, is just the amount of time they have with a patient. I know here in the UK, if you're seeing your general practitioner, you have about 9 minutes, 10 minutes with them if you're seeing them under the state registered system. So it's hardly enough time to be going through complex information and really explaining statistics and data. I think another thing is that sometimes the doctors don't fully understand the statistics. And I think we've all got to understand, where does that data come from? Who's sponsored that data? That we've got to be aware of the role of where has the data come from and how can that be fully explained to a patient, I think. And we all have a responsibility, I think, to be, as you say, pursuing that, promoting our own personal agency, making sure we fully understand the information that we've been given.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Time is really an element. In the US, it's probably 10 to 15 minutes for your general practitioner meeting. And maybe if you're fortunate, you have great insurance, once a year, you might get to spend about an hour or something talking to them or whatever. Another piece of this in terms of informed consent and the challenge is that one size really doesn't fit all. We're individually different, and you have to explore different options. What works for you might not work for me. And that might mean that even with some of the drug rollouts that we have for certain conditions, we might need to do more research, provide other options. And sometimes we're not hearing all the information, certainly not in the public arena, that people need to know in order to make the best choices.
Yeah. And I know for myself as a patient, I do like to do my own research. I do like to sort of fully understand something before I make a decision. And that can be quite frustrating for some doctors, I think, but some really appreciate it and they're really welcoming that you are, working alongside them and understanding your own body and your own choices. So, that can cause some tension sometimes with some doctors if you've been consulting Dr. Google, shall we say.
Well, and I like something you're saying now. You're talking about what I consider a great opportunity, which is the partnership between the doctor and the patient, because we're both bringing in fields of knowledge and information, even if the patient has no knowledge other than their history and what they've experienced over the years, how valuable that is. And I think in the United States, for sure, that the historical relationship between patients and doctors has been one of the doctor knows best. You need to follow the doctor's orders and don't ask too many questions. So, I mean, I don't know how it is in the UK, but what would you say about that?
Having swung all so far in one direction, I'm really heartened to see, and I'm due to interview a young doctor on my podcast who has a different view of this and is beginning to go back to the importance of taking a full patient history and understanding the patient. And an example, a story I read the other day is of an elderly gentleman coming in with, I don't know, some sort of serious thing, and the doctor can't find anything wrong, and off he goes, and then he comes back again. And it's only on taking a full history and going, oh, your wife died a year ago and something else happened. And by the time you look at other things that are going on in the patient's life, you begin to understand that there's some stuff going on under the surface, and maybe that needs to be explored or something different. And sometimes, again, the listening is part of the cure.
And taking the time to listen,
Yes.
sure, to see how all the puzzle pieces fit together. First, you've
Yeah.
got to have enough time and maybe exploration to reveal the puzzle pieces and then figure out how they fit. So, yeah, I think that's really important what you're saying.
So one of the reasons I got into the work that I do is that a true story, a library book fell on my head in the library here. I'd gone to look for a recipe book, and a book, hardback book, fell on my head. And I took it out of the library. I saw it as a sign to, read me. And this book was called Love, Medicine, and Miracles. It's by one of your US doctors called Dr. Bernie Siegel, who's a cancer doctor. But in that book, he is explaining exactly that, sometimes, and he was treating cancer patients and also children, but sometimes you need to be looking beneath the surface to say, what's going on at home? What's going on in your life? Not that that's necessary to blame, but we can take that into account when we're looking at the whole treatment plan, the whole understanding of you as a person. And Dr. Bernie Siegel is brilliant in that he would get people drawing and chatting. And he started a group called ECAP, Exceptional Cancer Patients, where he would get people in a room for a sort of workshop and, just get them listening to each other, drawing, singing, I don't know. But, this kind of thing of bringing people together and enable them to explore themselves as well as their problem is part of the way forward, I think. And that book inspired me to say, can't we do the same with legal and commercial problems? Why not?
Hi, it's Dr. Karen here, and I hope that you are enjoying today's show. Just wanted to drop in to remind you that succession is an intentional process. So remember to contact me to figure out how best to create that culture of development so that you have a successor when you're ready to leave and go to the next step in your life. You can reach me at Dr. Karen, Karen, at transleadership.com. Now enjoy the rest of the show. Absolutely. And I'm so glad you mentioned Dr. Bernie Siegel because I'm familiar with him and I love his way of thinking about issues. And so let's even unpack that a little bit because we might think, okay, dancing and singing and so on, and what does that have to do with anything? What were the results for his cancer patients? Because that's rather compelling.
I think what he found is that it didn't necessarily extend their life. It might do, but it gave them more life, more energy, more purpose in what they were doing. It maybe gave them more joy. It's like for any of us, if we can find purpose and joy in what we're doing, even if that's in the midst of a conflict or a dispute or challenging times in the world in general, then we are going to find we've got more energy. We're going to find we're more able to reach out to others rather than just look inwards to ourselves. And I think it's that reaching out, it's that growing, it's that being more conscious of the world we're in and of other people in that world that enables us to find more purpose and more joy, I find anyway.
Sometimes the quality of life is even really more important than how long you live. You live life to the fullest for however long you're here. Certainly
Yeah.
sounds like a great idea. So
Yeah.
yeah, sometimes when a book falls on your head, it's like God saying, pay attention. I've got something for you to do.
That was the message, actually, Karen. Absolutely. I think I need to take this book out and read it.
Well, thank God you did because now you're adding value in some new ways
Yeah.
in the landscape out there. So I'm glad to hear that. So, Jane, what is it going to take for people to renew their minds and maybe to take more responsibility for their health outcomes or even other outcomes in their lives? Say more about how your work helps them across maybe these multiple spheres.
It's a challenge for everybody at the moment. I think so many of us, in the way this sort of world is developing with all the technology that's available, which, maybe we wouldn't be talking to each other without Zoom now. So you see the benefits of the technology, but it can encourage us to become more dependent, less self-determining. And I think, my sense of the way the world has developed is that we can become more dependent on technology, on each other to solve problems, and that actually the answer is it's up to us. It's always up to us as individuals to step up, to become more aware of what's going on around us, to become more aware of other people. And that is, one of the challenges, I think, is how do we do that for ourselves, and how do we encourage other people to do that? And I think we only do it by empowering other people. Anytime we're in an interaction with other people, if we understand the way that we can empower that person, which can simply be by listening to them and giving them the last word. That can be as simple as that. Here's what I think. What do you think? That is giving power back to someone. And simple steps like that can be ways that we can show other people how to be empowered.
That's interesting what you're saying because I was thinking almost the opposite when it comes down to technology. And you were talking about maybe being related to people becoming more dependent. And in some respects, if I think about it kind of maybe with a psychological lens, people are becoming more independent because of technology, and they're not interacting as much sometimes with other people and learning the social skills that are necessary to have the kind of
Yeah.
conversations that you've been talking about.
I think that's true. And I think what I've experienced here in the UK, certainly for people in businesses as well as individuals, is they've got used to the idea that maybe they don't need to go into the office. Maybe they don't need to socialize with friends so much. Maybe they can stay at home and watch Netflix instead of going out. And this is a challenge, I think, for everybody. You know, I've had some people say to me, we have our board meetings online now, but those meetings are very functional. And where we might have gone into the office early and had some coffee and some chat, now we turn on the Zoom and we have our meeting and then we're gone. And so we have got out of this habit of being sociable, having some small talk, you know, having some jokes and sharing some food. And these things, particularly the breaking of bread, the sharing of food, we really totally underestimate how important it is to do those things. And usually, if we meet together with our friends and neighbors, the first thing you do is share a drink, share some food, set the table. And there's a reason for that. That breaking of bread, that sharing of food, that sharing of the space is really, really important, I think. And some of the mediations I've done and colleagues have done have been transformed by the sharing of food at the same time.
So it's creating community at a certain level,
Yeah,
around the dinner table or the lunch table, whatever it is.
yeah.
And it's opening up the space, perhaps in a different way.
I was thinking about that. It is about, so always thinking about what space am I creating and what does that look and feel like, even if it is online, you know, how can we, you set up this interview beautifully, Karen. And I think, you know, just taking the time to do that rather than diving straight in and being very functional, right? We're here, let's start, you know, welcome everybody, think of something, connects people. We have to just be a little bit more creative, but thinking about how do we reconnect. It's all about how do we connect with each other.
Yes, connect and reconnect. I like that. I like that as a concept and a way of thinking about
Yeah.
things. There are a lot of forces in our world today that really make personal agency kind of difficult. And I know in the United States in particular, it's really hard to have an alternative view and perspective. If it doesn't fit the party line, then very often you sort of get deplatformed or somehow demonized or whatever. What else do you think is going on in terms of these forces in the world? And what can be done about some of those challenges?
Think again, it's human nature. And I think we've got to a tipping point, and, you know, human nature and the way it plays out in society tends to ebb and flow and swing backwards and forwards. And we're at a point where we seem as a human race to be intent on kind of controlling each other. So this desire to be overly controlling of narratives and of what people can say and what people can do has come to the fore. And that can be assisted, of course, by technology, because you can literally switch someone off, can't you, if they're relying on technology rather than going down to the cafe. You know, it's easy to disconnect someone from the channel that they've chosen to express their views through. And I think we're seeing that power being played out. And no, I'm all for freedom of speech. And I think that's a challenge and I actually don't think I've written a blog about this today because I was at my book club yesterday, which is a delightful group. And we had such a wide ranging conversation about so many things, including talking about US politics. You may be surprised to know.
No, not surprised at all. I know you guys keep up with that more than most Americans do. So.
Yes. But, you know, it was just lovely to have that ability to have an open and honest conversation. So we don't all agree with everything here, but none of us needs to shut the other one down. Let's hear each other out. And to me, there's something wrong if you don't want to hear and don't want to learn from what your colleagues and friends and family have got to say. And how do we, again, use these principles that are so present in the mediation process to say, I'm curious to hear what you've got. Here's what I think, but I'm curious to know where you're coming from on this issue, and to approach that with an open mind, which is to say, I could be wrong. I think I'm right, or I think I've got some good information, but I'd like to hear where you come from. rather than feeling so defensive and adversarial. And that defensive mindset and approach is quite a natural one, but it also is much more collaborative to hear what other people have got to say because we can find better ways forward.
Well, I've always found it very enriching to talk
Yeah,
to people who have a very different background, whatever it is. They may
yeah,
come from a different country, they may have a different religious perspective, they may
yeah,
be of a different race. There are all kinds of ways we can be different age groups. And I still find that, wow, it makes the world so fascinating. And I learn more if I'm willing to engage people who may not think the same as I do. Maybe someone who's far opposite and spectrum politically or whatever it is, I'm still deeply curious to know how they see what they see and what are some of the reasons.
absolutely. And one of the other things I think is interesting, and I've explored this a little bit, is the difference between linear and lateral thinking. Now, linear thinking is where you've got a problem and you see, say, one narrative about the problem and one narrative about the solution, and you want to get to the solution as quickly as possible. So you just go in a straight line. Whereas lateral thinking is this big picture thinking. Here's what I think the problem is, but it might be more nuanced and bigger than I think it is. So let's explore actually what is the problem, what is the issue, and how do others see it? And then how do I get to a solution? Well, it might be a very wiggly path because there may be lots of other options. And I described it the other day in a blog as the difference between going in a motorboat and going in a sailing boat. If you go in a motorboat, you go as fast as you can from point A to point B, and you take no notice of the wind and the weather and the waves. But if you're in a sailing boat, you take notice of what's going on. And actually, it may be that I don't want to end up at point B. I want to end up at point C, given what I've just learnt. And so, we need to be more flexible, more open to, and I call that the zigzag principle.
And you're zigging and zagging from what to what?
Well, you're just zigging. So if you're in a sailing boat, you're zigging and zagging to go with the flow of the wind and the waves. And then you may decide, oh, given there's a storm coming, I'm now going to head in this direction. Or we've got a calm, so I'm going to sit still for a bit and think. So it's less urgent, but you're reacting and responding more to things that are coming up along the journey.
Well, yes, and that's a great way to do sailing because otherwise you may find yourself overcome by events and it may
Yes.
not be a good trip in that sense. You've got to pay attention to the environment around you, so to speak, in order to have a good sailing trip. So now let's apply that to people a little bit because some people are wired towards this big picture view and big picture thinking, and others may be more wired towards the linear. Yet I'm imagining that this way of operating can also be learned to some extent. And so let's say you're working with a group of very linear minded people. How do you convey this concept to them in the way that seems attractive and something that they want to learn about?
I think partly it's explaining, maybe with stories like I've just given you about the sailing boat and so on, but it's more through, certainly if I was working with them, maybe giving them an experience of that. What does that feel like? One of the workshops I have run, which is great fun, is what to do when you don't know what to do. And I actually had a room full of judges who were learning to not what to do when they don't know what to do. And we use some of the skills of improv theatre, which you may be familiar with, which is how do you create a scene, a scenario, when you have got no script? And actually, we had them all running around saying hello to each other as if they had a lemon in their mouth, for example, where you're out of your comfort zone. But the key rule in improv theatre, as well as in lateral thinking, is you have to say yes. You can't say no because that blocks progress. So whatever happens, you've got to say yes. And here's what I'll think, or here's where we'll go next, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love what you're saying because you're talking about people experiencing it. And it's nothing better than the experience of the richness of this kind of engagement and interaction. It sells itself, so to speak, when people see, oh, I can get a whole lot more out of this than
Yeah.
the way that I typically operate. So great. So, Jane, you're an author of many books, but let's talk first about your book, The Mole and the Mountain. Tell us about that book, why you wrote it, what's the big message in there, who is it for?
Oh gosh, thank you very much. Well, The Mole and the Mountain, again, I think this book sort of came to me. I started off with a concept, actually a concept of a map, which represents our journey through all the challenges that life presents, but also the journey that my clients go on in dealing with challenge and conflict. And there are four particular parts to that journey that we go through, and we often go through them over and over again during our life. There's the storm, a crisis. There's what I call the murky swamp of reality. We get stuck in a place where we can't see where we're going clearly. We may not see where we want to go. Then we've got what I call the bridge of courage, where you've got to make a choice, and that choice can take you onward, or it may take you into a place that I call the nowhere abyss. You're stuck in the abyss, and then onward to the mountaintop of experience. How do we get to that place where we are seeing the bigger picture? We're more conscious of ourselves and others in the world around us. So I wanted to represent that, and I've done that through a parable, if you like, about a mole called Morris the Mole. Just very briefly to tell you what happens to Morris is there is a great storm one day, and the oak tree, 300-year oak tree under which Morris has lived his entire life, completely blows down. So the landscape, as we've all experienced in the last few years, is not going back to how it was before, ever. And so you have to make a choice. Do I stay in the dark and pretend everything's going to be as it was, and or do we venture forth and try to find the light, the opportunities? And so the book represents Morris's journey into finding the opportunities that he can find, but also the challenges he finds on this journey through this new landscape.
And I hope he gets there.
He does get there, but there's always a twist in the tale at the end. So here's a copy of the book, by the way, The Mole and the Mountain. It's a little parable. And yeah, it's been great fun. And now I've had a life-size model made by a puppeteer of Morris, and we go on our journeys together. So each week I'm like, where is Jane and Morris going this week?
Well, that's really creative, and that's a lot of fun. So this book, is it for business people? Is it for everyday people? I mean, is there a children's version? Tell us.
It's the same version for everybody. It's readable by children. It can be read to children. It's dedicated to my grandchildren, but it's equally, I am using it with my corporate clients in the boardroom, because it's the principle of the story that matters. And there'll be no surprise to you, Karen, that the principle is self-determination.
Well, that's wonderful. You know, I'm already into it. I love it.
I know we have this little mantra, if you've got a problem and you've read the book, you can say, what would Morris do? Problem? What would Morris do? I wonder what Morris would do. And you can think through the different sections of the book and the map. Think, oh, there we are. I'm stuck in the murky swamp with this particular problem. What would Morris do?
And I love the fact that it's equally valuable for children, because I think the earlier we can start sharing these kinds of approaches to life with young people, the more prepared they will be for adult life in a constantly changing landscape. So that's just great news to hear that it works on all spectrums that way.
Yeah, and you could certainly read it to a child and then say to the child, what would Morris do if you've got a problem? Because we want to encourage our young people to be self-determining as well. How do they? It's so easy as a parent or even as a boss to step in and go, let me make the decision. Let me do this for you. And we shouldn't do that. We should allow them to say, here's what I'd like to do, or here's what I think I should do. So, yeah.
That's how they learn.
Yeah.
They've got to have some experience doing it. So now, just very briefly, tell us a little bit about your other two books as well, How to Beat Bedlam in the Boardroom and Boredom in the Bedroom, and The Authority Guide to Conflict Resolution. So just give us a little sentence about each of those.
Yeah, so thank you. So the Boardroom book was the first one I wrote, and I wrote that because I had been working with chief executives running sort of training courses, and they had to come up with this thing, what do I do with my teenage son or daughter who's maybe on drugs or smoking or won't tidy their bedroom? And we role played that scenario. And so in the book I've written a little story in each chapter which reflects what's going on at home and what's going on at work, and just, just to show that there's always a juxtaposition, there's always something going on at the other side, and that it's filled with some principles about conflict resolution. And the other one literally is a little pocketbook. It's called The Authority Guide to Conflict Resolution. And I wrote that because I'd just written a little video program, which is, again, I use with organizations. They can access these mini videos and look at me explaining some of the principles that I work with. So that takes people through a sort of several steps in conflict resolution, but explains again clearly all the principles that I work with. So, yeah.
So in one case, they have almost like a little toolkit, if you will, the conflict resolution one. And then in the other book, they get to see the parallels between business and personal life and how really life is intertwined that way. It really is.
Absolutely. That's right. Yes.
So how can people reach you? And let me phrase it this way too. You do consulting work in mediation. You do other kinds of consulting work. Tell us about that. And people can engage you for public speaking as well. So how can they get a hold of you?
Thank you. Yeah, so I do all of those things. I work as a mediator, as a speaker, and do come into organizations which can be not in the UK. I've worked with organizations in Hong Kong and in the US as well, being able to work remotely now. And I'm basically helping them in times of change, challenge, and crisis, and how do they resolve conflict. My website is janegunn.co.uk. And my email is jane@janegunn.co.uk. So quite easy to reach. And I'm also found on LinkedIn. And actually, I blog 4 days a week on LinkedIn. So that's a really good place to find me or learn a little bit more about how I think and how I write about things. And then every 2 weeks, I do a little newsletter, which is a summary of my LinkedIn blogs and some other things. So I think on most of my LinkedIn blogs, and I'm happy to provide you if anybody wants to sign up for some inspiration about conflict.
Can they sign up if they go to the website?
Yes.
That's really good. And tell us about your podcast, because back to the Barefoot Mediator, you've got a podcast as well.
So I have a podcast as well. Like you, I just enjoy chatting to people, learning different perspectives on life. So I've interviewed, for example, Dr. Bernie Siegel twice. I've interviewed Kenneth Cloak, who's one of the grandfather of mediation from your own continent. I've interviewed recently Howard Behar, who was the president of Starbucks. So I've got some very, very interesting guests on there, and I really, really enjoy that. So if people want to hear, or I've got any suggestions for other people that would be pertinent to interview, I like to kind of think about what do we need to hear about in the times we're living in? What would help people, managing these challenging times, I think.
And that's why you're here today, because we need to hear about what you're talking about as well.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Jane, for being here and sharing all that you're sharing.
Oh, thank
Yeah,
you.
absolutely. In the time that we have remaining, what are some of your additional words of wisdom that you want to leave for my community of business executives? What else would you like them to know or to reflect on?
I'd leave you with, and in the corner of the map that I use that's in my book, I've got a little signpost with what I call my 4 values on, which are listen, learn, love, and laugh. And it's important, and I bring these out at any workplace that I work in or any mediation I do. Listen means we must listen to each other with an open heart and hear what the other person's got to say. Learn means I must be open to learning and being curious to acquire new information. Love actually means I'll treat somebody with courtesy and respect. And to laugh is so important. It doesn't mean I'm making fun of people. It means let us find humor and humility in the situations we're in. And so I think listen, learn, love, and laugh are the values I like to bring to my work, but I like to bring them to other people as well and say, it doesn't matter how tough times are, we can find humor and humility no matter what we have to go through, and we can do that together.
I love it. I love it. And especially laughing together, it changes our whole emotional state, our psyche, everything.
Yes.
And I think it opens us up to additional possibilities.
Yes, it does. And as you can see, I like to laugh anyway. So,
It's wonderful.
why subdue that when it can be part of me and part of the experience that I have with my clients?
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, Jane, for being here. Thank you for sharing all that you've shared. And to everyone out there, Jane has these wonderful books. She has the blog, she has newsletters, and she has the podcast, and she can also come to speak. Jane, let me ask this on the speaking issue. When you went to the UN and when you went to the White House, what did you talk about?
So it was many years ago. I went in 1998 and the mediation world was quite new. It was the Y2K, the year 2000, millennium bug. And I knew that the White House had a program on it. It was being run by somebody called John Koskinen. I actually made a cold call to the White House and persuaded them that they'd like to hear about the project I was involved in, which was called the Millennium Accord. And then as a result of that, I got invited to the United Nations, where they have what they call a Y2K meeting. There I met a wonderful ambassador called Ambassador Kamal, and he wrote the foreword to my first book, which was a wonderful relationship, which resulted simply from sort of following my heart and making these calls. And it was a great experience. But the Millennium Accord, just to finish off, one of the things I think is really important, I have a map in my book, but I think we should all have a map, which is a manifesto and a pledge. And the Millennium Accord was a pledge that 500 large companies signed to say that they would deal with any challenges that they had coming out of the Millennium Bug without resort to arms, adversarial resolution methods. So it's the idea that we can have our own manifesto, express our own values, but also have a pledge. That's how I'm going to behave towards each other. I'm not going to become adversarial. I'm not going to become aggressive. It doesn't matter what the problem is. We'll find a way through it together. And that was an actual pledge that companies signed up to.
How beautiful. And it's not too late. People can still sign that today because we still have big issues to address in
Yeah.
today's world. So I'm glad that you shared what you shared at the White House and at the UN. I know people will be interested in that. So,
Thank you.
so what I'd like to close with today is just a reminder that Job in the Bible, when he was going through a lot of heartache and difficulty, and he was challenging God on all of this, and did God, in essence, really know what he was doing? So God comes back and he's answering him. And I want to frame it this way. If God is the creator, and I believe he is, he knows more about us than we even know about ourselves. And wouldn't it be wise for us to go back to him to learn more about how we should operate? So I'm going to read these verses. It's Job, the 40th chapter. I'll start there in verse 7. It says, God is answering Job, and he says, now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. He says, would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God, or can you thunder with a voice like his? Then adorn yourself with majesty and splendor, and array yourself with glory and beauty. Disperse the rage of your wrath. Look on everyone who is proud and humble him. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low. Tread down the wicked in their place. Hide them in the dust together. Bind their faces in hidden darkness. And then God says, if you can do all of that, then I will also confess to you that your own right hand can save you. Then he goes on to the 41st chapter, and then he's describing to Job this creature he's created called Leviathan, which sounds like a really fearsome dragon type character that you really can't tangle with as a human being. And then he further says, no one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. So God then says, who then is able to stand against me? Who has preceded me that I should pay him? Everything under heaven is mine. So let's go back to the Creator, because we are fearfully and wonderfully made by him, as is said in Psalm 139. And if we want to know how our bodies work, how our minds work, or anything else about us, That's the place to go for the greatest wisdom. So think about that this week. Enjoy your week as you increase personal agency and more informed consent for the decisions that you have to make in your life. See you next time. You've been listening to The Voice of Leadership with me, Dr. Karen Wilson Starks. And I want to give a special thanks to jazz saxophonist Ron McMillan for granting us permission to use his gifted music on our show. Thanks for listening, and remember to go to my website, transleadership.com, for more strategies, insights, and leadership resources.